So according to the Food and Drug Administration's or FDA's database in 2022, approximately 94% of all soybeans, 96% of all cotton, and 92% of all corn planted in the U.S. was genetically modified. Genetic modifications can be done to nearly anything in today's day and age, but most commonly it refers to the food that's surrounding us, and we don't even know that it is genetically modified. So today I'm going to inform you all about the increased use of genetic modification in crops. I'll be specifically talking about genetically modified corn and how the genetic modification process occurs, and then finally some benefits and downfalls that popularly surround genetic modification of crops. So finally, after informing you, I'll try to facilitate a discussion around opinions, insights, or even questions you may all have regarding this very relevant topic. So besides being one of many people that consume genetically modified food from grocery stores and even in restaurants today, I've done extensive research and some other presentations on this topic. So GMO stands for genetically modified organism. This could be a plant, an animal, or even a microbe whose DNA has been modified in some way. PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction, which I'll touch on the steps of that later. But the purpose is to rapidly produce billions of copies of DNA segments, and then they're going to be used in other organisms. BT is what I'm going to use when I'm referring to Bacillus thuringiensis bacterium. That's a species that is going to be associated with the corn that I'm talking about. Okay, so now that I've laid out some of these crucial terms, I'm going to inform you all about genetically modified corn, starting with a more in-depth introduction to BT corn and the processes used to create it, and then finally the advantages and disadvantages surrounding this. So let's start by taking a closer look at genetically modified corn. According to the University of Maryland's College of Agricultural and Natural Resources as of 2023, BT corn was first introduced and adopted in the U.S. in 1996. So BT corn was introduced in hopes to be able to resist insects, specifically caterpillars, which are the major predator of the corn. And the BT aspect enabled the corn to produce a BT delta endotoxin protein, which is basically toxic to these caterpillars. And it was in hopes to fight off the caterpillars so you'd have higher corn yields because less would be damaged. But the toxin was not toxic to humans or cattle or anything that was around or would consume it, except for the caterpillars. So now that I've given you all a general idea of what BT corn is, let's take a further look into the processes used to create this type of corn. The process of introducing a BT gene into corn varieties is explained on a superficial level through 9 steps, and this is outlined in Dr. Sagar Aral's research publication in 2022. First, you have to identify the gene of interest that you want to use, which I said was the BT gene. Second, you isolate this gene. This is done through obtaining soil samples with the BT bacteria, and then you heat shock it, which means make it really hot, 70 degrees Celsius, and you're only left with that desired gene alive. Then you amplify this gene to produce many copies of it, and this is using that PCR method that I said I was going to explain, which is 3 steps. The first is denaturation, which means the complementary DNA strands that are together are going to be heated up until they separate. The second is annealing, which means lowering that temperature back down. It allows primers to bind onto them, and the strands are going to come closer together. The third step of PCR is extension, which means a DNA polymerase enzyme is using the primers that were attached to add nucleotides onto the DNA and develop it further. So then the DNA would be back together, and you use PCR. The fourth step of the major steps is association of that BT gene with a sequence, and then you're inserting plasmids. So the plasmid in this case is acting as a vessel, and it's going to transport the DNA into a desired nucleus so you can get that gene in there. The fifth step is multiplying the plasmid for the injection, and that's just basic lab growth cultures. The sixth step is then transferring the construct that I just talked about into the recipient tissue. So these plasmids that I just mentioned are going to be put into the embryo stage of corn development, and they have to start that early so they can be accepted into the corn. Next is integration of the gene into the recipient genome. So you can't just physically place it into a corn embryo. It's done through a process called gene gun bombardment, which uses very small metal particles that are coated with the DNA that you just made, and then it's using compressed helium and basically shooting it through a corn embryo, which is kind of cool. And then expressing the gene in the recipient genome, you just plant the corn that you just did, and it'll grow up, and then it has that desired trait. And then inheritance in future generations, you continue to reproduce this corn, continue to plant it, and future generations will show that resistance with the BT that you inserted into it. So it's a lot, but now that I've introduced how the BT corn is made, we're going to look further into some advantages and disadvantages surrounding this. So Healthline's article by Ryan Raymond in 2023 provides both opinions very thoroughly while also being cognizant of controversies surrounding this topic that some people may see. So I'm going to start by explaining the advantages. Economically speaking, production of higher crop yields increases payouts when you're planting corn. Environmentally speaking, you would use less cleared land because you would have higher yields, and use less physical pesticides, which would reduce our carbon footprint agriculturally. And then societally speaking, an increased crop yield has the potential to be used in impoverished countries and get more food for people that may not be able to get it. So now some disadvantages. Economically speaking, genetic modified crop production is often controlled by large companies and monopolies, and it is not able to be used on smaller scales for smaller farm productions, which could put them out of work. Environmentally, increased amounts of genetically similar crops can limit local biodiversity and increase competition to native species, which can make them go extinct. And societally, newly implemented genetically modified traits could cause adverse health effects because you're testing new things out to people, animals, pollinators, and that can happen worldwide, which can be very detrimental. So, as corn is the most common crop grown in the United States and over 90% of it is genetically modified, I found it very imperative to inform you all on this topic. Recent trends even outline continued increased use towards further genetic modifications in the future, and I thought it was extremely important for you all to understand how this process is done. So hopefully my speech today will allow you to understand this topic more deeply and be able to make an educated impact in the future if you may want to. And to sum up, I've done my best to inform you all about the rise of genetic modification on crops worldwide in the past decade. I aim to introduce you all to BT corn and how it is created, as well as some advantages and disadvantages surrounding genetic modification of crops in general. And now I hope to hear what your take may be on this trend of increased genetic modification. And I'm going to start by asking everyone in the room that thinks that genetic modification in general is a larger disadvantage to raise your hand. Just generally. You don't have to stick with this forever. Larger disadvantage than advantage? Okay, you can put your hands down. So anyone that thinks it's a larger advantage than disadvantage, you can raise your hand. Okay, we're like split half and half almost. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to some general questions. This can be in relation to what I told you, what you've known before, so we can just kind of see what everyone thinks about this. So what is the first thing that comes to your mind when I mentioned or someone else mentions genetic modification? Yeah?
Unnatural.
Unnatural, okay. Anyone else? First thing that comes to your mind. This could have been before my speech. Yeah?
One time, I was in my kitchen with my dad, and I forget what the vegetable was, but it looked weird, and he called it, he's like, oh, this must be genetically modified, like as a joke. So
okay,
that's what I thought.
Yeah, so generally before I researched this too, and even now, genetically modified things, you think like, obviously not natural, it kind of looks weird, there's something that has been done to it, right? So it has almost like a bad undertone, in my opinion. So now that I've told you about this genetic modification process and some of the advantages and disadvantages, has your view changed maybe since you came in the room? If you thought genetic modification was better before or bad before, do you see some of the better sides to it maybe?
I stand in the middle ground.
Stand in the middle ground? Was that how you felt before too? Yeah, kind of how I am. Yeah?
Yeah, I think it was pretty cool what you said about the whole, like, being able to shoot the
Yeah, that's kind of my favorite part too. So, in the future, I didn't make a future section, although I've researched it. So I want to kind of see what you guys know about this, maybe, or think could happen. What do you see genetic modification looking like in the future? So I've told you about a little bit what is happening now, but like, what do you think could happen with genetic? Yeah.
Well, you said that like bigger like corporations and stuff are utilizing it, so I see in the future probably it getting more use just because of the control that larger corporations have, especially in our country.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I'll say the downside, with genetically modifying all of these like crops and everything so that all of these insects aren't going to just devour everything, they're eventually going to be able to adapt to then overcome what we've modified, and then we're going to have to modify it even more, and then it's just going to be
Make them stronger and stronger, and every time you do that, you don't know what else it could affect. It could affect us, could affect cattle, things like that surrounding it.
Also they might have different evolutions past us, and we're just on the brink of unlocking.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So the biggest thing I think of, honestly, with genetic modification in the future is spreading to other food groups. So I mentioned like soybeans, corn, cotton is a big one as well, but I talked about the factor in a lot of impoverished countries that's starting to become a bigger thing because they're able to produce more food, and then they would kind of get rid of that hunger issue. So spreading to other types of crops and things like that could be very detrimental because you don't know how the outcome's going to come out. Every crop is different, it has different effects and things like that. So let's see. So if you had the power to implement laws or rules in this field, what would you put into place regarding genetic modification? So maybe if you said you're in the middle, what rule would you put into place so it doesn't get out of hand, or maybe anything like that?
Well, there's always going to be some form of loophole that people are going to be able to find.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that.
Because there's loopholes in the laws.
Anyone else? Good?
Cool, thanks, sorry.
Too long.